Hello, I'm Hazel Dempster with Analysis of the Fisherman by W.B. Yeats. This poem was written in 1916 and the cultural context is particularly important for this poem, so if we look at that first briefly before we move on to analysis. So in 1904, Yates, along with his great friend Lady Gregory, helped to found the influential Abbey Theatre in Dublin. In 1907, Yeats's friend Synge wrote The Playboy of the Western World, which was first performed at the Abbey Theatre. However, the Irish audience hated this play so much that they rioted. And if you're interested in this, you may like to read some of the accounts. They're fascinating. And for example, the leading man called the audience a mob of howling devils. Why did they object to this play so much? Essentially, they considered it un-Irish, a feeling that was stirred up by Irish nationalists who saw the play as an insult to their country. Now, Yates, as a founder of the theatre and as a friend of Synge's, was appalled by what he saw as this disgraceful behaviour on the part of the Irish public. So this poem, The Fisherman, was written in a spirit of resentment and scorn towards contemporary Irish society. And that brings us to the key concern of the poem. Given his disgust with the Irish public, whom is Yeats writing for? Now, Yeats believes he doesn't have a worthy audience, so he invents one. He creates an imaginary ideal represented by the symbol of the wise and simple fisherman. Let's turn to an overview of the structure of the poem. It's a helpful way of analysing this poem, as with so many of Yeats's poems. So briefly, the first 8 lines describe the fisherman. Then in lines 9 to 24, Yeats expresses his contempt for contemporary Ireland. And in the last stanza, lines 25 to 40, Yeats turns back to the ideal image of the fisherman and dedicates his poetry to him. So let's look in detail at the first 8 lines which describe the fisherman. They read, "Although I can see him still, the freckled man who goes to a grey place on a hill in grey Connemara clothes, at dawn to cast his flies, it's long since I began to call up to the eyes this wise and simple man." So let's now look at the characteristics that this fisherman is given. He's simple. He's called this directly by Yeats, but it's also shown in the plain monosyllabic words used to describe him. There are alternate full rhymes, and they're all full rhymes in this section, A, B, A, B, and that's a reflection of the balance and the simplicity of this fisherman. The enjambment here adds to the harmony, adds to the sort of fluidity of this natural image. And the fisherman is very connected to the rural Connemara landscape. Connemara is a district in Western Ireland, and just as the Irish airman in An Irish Airman Foresees His Death is very much connected to Kiltartan Cross, he in fact says, "My country is Kiltartan Cross," so too is this fisherman very much connected to a local specific place in Ireland, Connemara. And he forms part of the landscape because the poem describes how he goes to a grey place on a hill in grey Connemara clothes. So not only is he dressed in homespun Connemara cloth, which the area is known for, but he's actually merged in that repetition of grey, merged with the local stone. And his connection with nature is emphasised also because he's associated with the dawn, which is when he appears. Now, this fisherman is also skilled. He's a fly fisherman, and Yeats himself was a keen fisherman who's interested in fly fishing and would have understood how skilled you would have to been to be a fly fisherman. And this fisherman is completely absorbed in his action. He's associated with verbs. He goes to a grey place on the hill. He's about to cast his flies. And he's solitary in his absorption, and that will form an important contrast to the Irish public, which Yeats will later go on to describe. Now, he's not named except by his action. Clearly, he's called the fisherman, and this is very explicit, therefore, from the beginning that he's not an individual, but a symbol. If we look a little closely at the construction of these lines, I think we see a tension here, because there is a simple diction or word choice as discussed, but there's quite a complex syntax, that's the order that the words are put together in. So if we look at the sentence, we've got the although is the first word of the poem starting that sentence. It's the start of a subordinate clause that runs for 5 lines until we get to the main clause, it's long since I began, and so on. Now, I think the different aspects of the language here reflect different aspects of the poem. The simple diction is reflective of the fisherman's nature, as we've discussed, and therefore reflective of what Yeats desires. But the complex syntax is a reflection of the complexity of Yeats's argument, because he's travelling back and forth from an ideal reality back to an ideal. So it's the kind of complexity of his intellectual thought that's informing the syntax here, I think. Let's move on to the next lines. So if we look at the reality in 9 to 24, this is kind of the bitter attack on the real contemporary Ireland. So Yeats writes, "All day I'd looked in the face what I hoped 'twould be to write for my own race, and the reality. The living men that I hate, the dead man that I loved, the craven man in his seat, the insolent unreproved and no knave brought to book who has run a drunken cheer, the witty man and his joke aimed at the commonest ear, the clever man who cries the catch cries of the clown, the beating down of the wise, and great art beaten down." So here Yeats openly acknowledges his hate for contemporary Irish society, and that's juxtaposed with his love for the dead man. That's widely accepted to be seen. And at the end of the poem, when he talks about the beating down of the wise and great art beaten down, that's explicitly referring to the riots about the playboy of the Western world, as discussed at the beginning. And that verb, beating, beaten, so that repetition of beat, is a reflection of Yeats's perception of the brutality of the Irish public. He also describes some of the abhorred types in Ireland. So if we just look at lines 21 to 22, he says, "The clever man who cries the catch cries of the clown." And we can hear his contempt here in the harsh alliteration, which is kind of cutting into those lines. Clever man cries, catch cries, clown, really biting away at those lines with disgust. Now, all the types that Yeats describes are the opposite of the fisherman, because they all have an audience. Instead of this sort of solitary rural figure, I think we have a kind of implicitly urban figure who's a performer to really the lowest common denominator as far as Yeats is concerned. You know, they're winning drunken cheers, their jokes are aimed at the commonest ear. If we look at the versification of these lines, it gives us an intensification of Yeats's disgust, because the full rhymes are breaking down to half rhymes, so we get discordant sounds throughout this section of the poem, which is a sort of reflection of Yeats's distaste and his contempt. This is also an extremely long sentence. It's a 16-line tirade, really, against the Irish public. There is some enjambment from line 18 onwards, but here I think it's a reflection of the sort of flood of Yeats's frustration and anger. So let's turn now to the last stanza, lines 25 to 40, and as a result of his disgust with contemporary Ireland, Yeats here returns again to the question, whom is he writing for? And he turns to the ideal of the fisherman, of course. So they read, "Maybe a 12 months since, suddenly I began, in scorn of this audience, imagining a man, and his sun-freckled face, and grey Connemara cloth, climbing up to a place where stone is dark under froth, and the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream, a man who does not exist, a man who is but a dream, and cried, before I am old I shall have written him one poem maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn." So here, Yeats adds even greater detail to the fisherman in defiance of reality. So, for example, he's not just freckled, but he's sun-freckles, and this little detail brings him that much closer to nature and the outside world. We also have this great visual description of his fly fishing, the downturn of his wrist when the flies drop in the stream. So there's that skill there, there's a kind of grace in activity. And he's absorbed, again, much like an Irish Emman in the Irish Emman foresees his death. The Irish Emman is absorbed in the act of flying, just as this fisherman is absorbed fully in the act of fishing. And this is a quality that Yeats really admires. We go back to mostly balanced full rhymes. There's one exception to that, and we'll discuss it at the end. But the mostly balanced full rhymes again return to the sense of harmony and peace now that Yeats has returned to his ideal fisherman. Now, very importantly in this section, Yeats explicitly draws our attention to the fact that the fisherman is imaginary. He says to us, "A man who does not exist, a man who's but a dream." His fantastic lines, I think. And I think the mainly monosyllabic words and the anaphora sort of strengthen the act of creation. Yeats wants to make it very clear that this man is purely being constructed inside of his mind. And he ends the poem with this fervent cry, "Before I am old, I shall have written him one poem maybe as cold and passionate as the dawn." So he's dedicating his poetry to this imaginary ideal. And he's got this oxymoronic phrase because it's cold and passionate, his poem. Now, you would expect passion to be hot, but Yeats imagines it to be cold. I think this makes more sense in light of Yeats's views on poetry as a whole. He claimed that all is personal soon rots, it must be packed in ice. Now, here he's discussing the importance of traditional poetic forms. But I think, even though that's from a different context, if we apply it to this poem, it assumes that he's offering a poem full of passion, but tightly controlled and therefore enduring, as this poem is. And there's a beautiful simile here too, because he says it's a poem as cold and passionate as the dawn. Now, this echoes dawn in the 5th line of the poem, where the fisherman was located at the beginning. And there's perhaps here a sense of hope, because dawn promises new beginnings and freshness, although you could argue that it's undermined by the lack of full rhyme that I mentioned earlier, because right at the end of the poem we don't have a full rhyme, so there's a kind of missing unity, if you like. So it's inconclusive, and I will leave it to you to decide whether you think this poem has some hope. So if you enjoy this poem, you may also be interested in, as I've mentioned, An Irish M and Foresees His Death. Excellent poem to compare this one to. Also concerned with an ideal man of action, although in the case of An Irish M, and perhaps more of an aristocratic ideal. You may also like to read September 1913, because that reveals Yeats's frustration with contemporary Ireland too. So I hope you found this analysis useful. I'll continue to do more of these YouTube tutorials. I do hope you'll join me.